Shabbat, morning, Michael, or referring to Shemitah. Right, so you sent to the group, Mr. Safdie, you sent to Jaime that we're on? Yeah. So what are we referring to? What type of plowing and what type of planting are we referring to? Shabbat, or we're talking about Shemitah? So Rabbi Akiva says, Eino sarach lo macharisha shviyas shviyas. Rabbi Akiva says, when the Torah, he understands the pasuk is talking about Shemitah. The Torah is telling you, what is the Torah telling you? It's not coming to teach us that you have to refrain from plowing and harvesting on Shemitah. Because we already have other psukim that teach us. Torah says during the Shemitah, you can't plant and you can't prune. And we learn out from those, we learn out all type of agricultural type of work during the Shemitah you cannot do. So we're talking about Shemitah now, right? Right. No, we don't need to come on to Shabbat from it. We have from the Shemitah Psukim themselves, we learn out all different agricultural, from the Shemitah Psukim, we learn out all different types of agricultural type of work that you can't do during the Shemitah year. So therefore, what do we need the pasuk? We don't need a repetition. The Torah doesn't repeat itself. If the Torah does repeat itself, you find many times the Torah, any time the Torah repeats itself, it's to teach you something, to some point. Like the Torah many times mentions Shabbat, the prohibition of Shabbat, maybe 12 times or something. So the Sefer Chinuch says we mention Shabbat so many times because how significant Shabbat is to the Jew, how important it is to the Jew, and everything is important. But the Shabbat is of such importance that Hashem wants to keep on hammering home that message of Shabbat, Shabbat, Shabbat. And I mean, the message is keep the Shabbat, take care of the Shabbat, and maybe that will be the reason how the Sefer Chinuch explains. Maybe there's other reasons why it's repeated, but that's his approach. So sometimes we have the Gemara says, sometimes the Torah repeats something to give you two low sases, not one lavim says, two low sases, to strengthen it more, possibly to give more malkut sometimes. So what's the point of this pasuk repeating itself? So the Gemara says, Elafilu charisha erev shviyit shenichnas l'shviyit, b'ksir shel shviyit sheyotz l'mos shviyit. Even the plowing of erev shviyit, 30 days before Shemitah, if you're going to plow, and that's going to help the land during the Shemitah, or kasir shel shviyit, or if something grew during the Shemitah year. Rashi says if it grew a third, as long as it grew a third, that's considered that it's a royally, it's fit to be cut, to be harvested. So once it's fit to be harvested during the Shemitah, meaning it grew a third during the Shemitah, that type of food you cannot cut in the normal way of Shemitah, that normal way. And if you did cut it in the 8th year, you need to treat it whatever the holiness of Kedusha Shviyat has. It has the holiness of Kedusha Shviyat. So the pasuk is coming to teach us regarding the harvesting, that the laws of Shemitah still apply, not only during the 7th year. We all know Shemitah is the 7th year. So now we're going to see this halachot that not only apply during the 7th year. Shemitah really starts kicking in 30 days before Shemitah. It's already called Tosfot Shviyas, and the Rabbanan even add. This is on a Torah level. The Torah is adding by this pasuk to Shemitah, but then there's rabbinically they even add certain fields. They even add earlier than 30 days before Shemitah. So really, the farmers are ready to the initial limitations, initial planting, that type of stuff starts. Depending on what type of field, even before Elul sometimes. So therefore, Shemitah is not just, people, we think of Shemitah as just the 7th year. And now we see, no, it starts even before the 7th year. There's something called Tosvot Shemitah. And then there's also certain things that apply even after the Shemitah year is over. If things that grew during the Shemitah year, things that grew during the Shemitah year have holiness, can have laws of Shemitah applied to it if it grew a minimum of a third. If it grew less than a third, it's not considered significant enough that it's like a Shabbat, what's called cooked, Michael ben Drusai, right? If it's cooked, something a third or a half, that's already considered that you violated the Shabbat. If a guy cooks something that it reached the level that a robber would be able to take it on the go, that's considered already cooked. Michael ben Drusai, a third or a half. So here's interesting similar third is considered already fit to cut, and therefore it would have, if it grew a third during Shemitah, it would have that kedusha. I just want to add a thought. It comes out that the source for Tosvot Shvius and is learned out from this pasuk that says, the pasuk says, 6 days. The pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim Tavo, Vayom Hashvi Tishbot, Becharish Makkos Tishbot. Correct? So but the language of the pasuk seems to be talking. The literal reading of the pasuk is we're referring to what? We're referring to the year of Shemitah itself, right? Michael, the pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim Tavo, Uvayom Hashvi Tishbot. The literal, and the Gemara is saying, Rabbi Akiva says, you know what it's referring to? It's not referring to the year of Shemitah itself. What is it referring to? The Tosvot Shemitah on both ends. Before Shemitah and after Shemitah. But notice, how did Hashem verbalize? How did he write this mitzvah of Tosvot Shemitah? How did he write it? He used words which indicate the year of Shemitah itself. That means that when he wrote this law, the Tosvot Shemitah, it was written as if he's talking about Shemitah itself. He's before the literal, the Pshuto Shemikra, we're talking about Shemitah, but we're not talking about Shemitah. We're talking about the 7th year, but we're not talking about the 7th year. And I presume the meaning is to give people the appreciation of this mitzvah, how you treat Tosvot Shvius, the fact that it's written in the same way you describe Shemitah itself, that people need to give it the respect, the same way you give that respect to Shemitah. Good morning, Akiva. Good morning, Mr. Azmi. Mr. Azmi is back.
I don't know. You sent it to me anyway. So
good to see you, Mr. Azmi. Good to see you, Akiva. Welcome back. Welcome back. So that's what the Torah writes in such a fashion that you should treat it. How do you like that, Mr. Safdie? Treat it like the Shemitah itself. Give the appreciation to the Tosvot Shemitah like the Shemitah itself. And it could be that maybe some things need chizuk in life. Some things need extra strengthening. And maybe that people should be careful in Tosvot Shemitah. And adding on to the Shemitah, we just said there's a law that not only during the Shemitah year the farmers can't work, but the 30 days before the Shemitah, where the plowing would already benefit the Shemitah year. If you plow within 30 days, it would have a great benefit to the land during Shemitah. You already have to stop plowing 30 days before. And then we also said there's certain laws that if it grew during the Shemitah at least a third, then it has holiness of Shemitah. They have to treat it even if you didn't cut, it wasn't cut during the 7th year. And it's in the 8th year. There's certain laws that are going to apply to Shemitah in the 8th year. And that's called Tosvot. That's just like on Shabbat. We're supposed to add to the Shabbat before the Shabbat. We're supposed to add to the Shabbat after the Shabbat. Like Yom Kippur. We're supposed to add before and we're supposed to add afterwards. Now we said yesterday, how much do you need to add to Shabbat? So Moshe Feinstein says you should try to add at least 2 minutes to the Shabbat. Don't do work up to sunset. Because if you do up to sunset, exactly up to sunset, then you didn't add anything. Of course, if you did it up to a second before sunset, technically you added a second. But Moshe says you should try to stop 2 minutes before sunset. Okay. Yom Kippur also is a special mitzvah Tosfos Yom Kippurim. Right. About very good. Bal Tosif means if you go ahead and you say, if you say that the Torah, let's say if you say, for instance, they're supposed to take 4 things for the lulav, adasim, aravos, and if you say I want to add an apple, that the Torah tells me to take an apple. The Torah never told you to take an apple together with that lulav and esrog. You're adding to the mitzvah. But if there's a rabbinic mitzvah, see the question is Toso Shabbat, is that minat Torah or Rabbanan? If you say adding to the Shabbat is Rabbanan, as long as you don't say it's Daraita, then you're not violating. How do you Hanukkah? How did the rabbi say it's Hanukkah? The Torah never gave a holiday called Hanukkah or Purim. Why is that a problem of Tosfot, Lo Tosif, adding to the Torah? The answer is, if they would say Hanukkah's minat Torah, that would be Tosfot. That would be about Tosif. It's not true. The Torah never told you about Hanukkah. They could say it's a mitzvah Rabbanan. That's one approach why it's not a violation of Baal Tosif. Some say it's the Rabbanan. I think Yom Kippur, more say it's Daraita. And Shabbat, many say, I think adding to Shabbat is the Rabbanan. We keep the Rabbanan. I always tell people, people, do you keep the Rabbanan? I say, do you keep Hanukkah? Do you keep Purim? And I'm just saying it because a lot of times people, and not for you, Michael, just
how you put on your tefillin.
right. Everything.
Black box strap is over.
Right. All how
What the
but Mark, that might be the Rabbanan explained the mitzvah, but they might be telling you what the biblical mitzvah is based on the oral Torah. But they might be telling you that might minat Torah, you have to do it that way. But then there's some things that didn't exist, and they created. Hanukkah didn't exist, and that's not Baal Tosif. They're not adding because they are just telling you this is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and the Torah says the Rabbanan to do these things. Okay. Now here, if the pasuk is actually telling you it's not Baal Tosif, the pasuk is actually saying about Shemitah. Okay. Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Rabbi Yishmael says he understands this pasuk when it says you should refrain from plowing and you should refrain from harvesting. It's referring to Shabbat. It says 6 days you shall work, the 7th day you shall rest. Plowing and harvesting you shall rest. Now that's what the pasuk he says referring to Shabbat. The other rabbi says it's not referring to Shabbat because why should the Torah emphasize these 2 melachot of Shabbat? Why does the Torah talk about plowing and harvesting? There's many other things about Shabbat. So therefore, that other Rabbi Akiva said it's referring to Shemitah, which is agricultural, which has to do with plowing and sowing. But this opinion says, but Rabbi Yishmael says it's back on Shabbat. And what is the Torah teaching you regarding Shabbat? So Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Ma chorish reshut, Moni Dr. Navid, Ma chorish reshut, Af katsir reshut. The Torah tells us, connects charisha, it talks about these 2 melachot, harvesting and plowing. Now, plowing, the Gemara says, is something that's a reshut. It's a type of activity that's a voluntary activity. It's not a mitzvah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah that says you have to plow. That's what the Gemara is thinking at this point, and then we'll see how the Gemara is going to discuss this. There's no mitzvah. Torah said, I need you to plow. One mitzvah. There's a lo sase, it's true. But want to know, is there a mitzvah to do? Is there any instruction in the Torah anywhere to go? There's a mitzvah in the Torah to write a sefer Torah. There's no mitzvah in the Torah to go ahead and what? And plow a field. There's no such mitzvah. There might be mitzvahs not to plow at certain times, like you said. So now the Gemara is ma charish rishut, just like charish, the idea of plowing is something that's that's a type of activity that people do because they voluntarily sign themselves to plow. So when the Torah says on Shabbat that you need to refrain from plowing and from harvesting, So the harvesting is similar to the plowing. It's a type of case. The case of the harvesting. The Torah says, "I don't want you to harvest." What type of harvesting are we referring to? Similar to the case of the plowing. What is plowing? Plowing is a voluntary act. So too, the type of act the Torah says you must refrain from on Shabbat, that you can't harvest, you can't cut the stuff off the trees, is also a voluntary act, an act that you sign yourself up for. But what about if the Torah tells you, gave you a mitzvah, I want you to go ahead and harvest. And the Torah says there's a mitzvah, let's say, by the Omer. There's a mitzvah of the Omer that you have a mitzvah to harvest, let's say the night on the 16th day of Nisan, the second day of Pesach, you have a mitzvah to harvest the new barley crop and to bring a korban Omer. The Torah gave you a mitzvah. The Torah tells you have to vavesim es omer. The Torah talks about, good morning, Mars. The Torah talks about tells you about and instructs you. And there's a special mitzvah of harvesting for this crop of the Omer. So that is not included in the prohibition on Shabbat. The prohibition that the Torah says, I want you to refrain from harvesting on Shabbat. You could do it on Shabbat. Just say, now Mr. Adri is looking at me and say, Rabbi, what's going on? I'll tell you, Mr. Adri, the Torah says you can't make a habura. You can't go ahead and make a wound to someone on Shabbat. Right? You can't make a wound. And yet the Torah says, on the 8th day, you do Brit Milah. So the Torah says and you know what? The Torah says one of the 39 malachot on Shabbat is you're not allowed to slaughter an animal. If I want to slaughter an animal for my own private purposes, I can't slaughter an animal for my own private purposes. But in the Beit HaMikdash, the Torah says we slaughter the animal on Shabbat. They slaughtered the animal on Shabbat. They brought korbanot on Shabbat. They slaughtered the Torah gave an allowance for that particular malacha under certain circumstances. So the same thing is for this mitzvah of harvesting the Omer. The Torah says you're not refrained, you're not restricted from harvesting either of a mitzvah. That mitzvah will even be able to be done on Shabbat. So that's what the Gemara, Rabbi Yishmael says. That's what the pasuk we can learn out from this pasuk, this unique law, this allowance to go ahead and harvest the new crop, the new barley crop, for the purpose of mitzvah of bringing the korban Omer. He says it's not talking. This opinion says this pasuk is not talking about Shemitah. You're right. He would have to come on to some other source. This opinion is talking about Shabbat, but the other opinion, who says that this pasuk is teaching us Tosfos Shemitah, that the pasuk is not referring to Shabbat. The other rabbi says this pasuk is talking about Shemitah. It's not teaching us this law about Shabbat and the harvesting the Omer. So we have two different opinions how to interpret what this pasuk is referring to. Is the pasuk referring to Shabbat or the pasuk referring to Shemitah? So now we're focusing on this opinion that says, Rabbi Yishmael says, that it's talking about Shabbat. So now, that is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Now comes Amar Le'ahu Mirabanan. One of the rabbis says to Rava. He says to Rava, Mimai de Charisha de Rishut. How do you know that it's referring to Charisha de Rishut? I have extra Gemara for anybody here. How do we know it's a Charisha de Rishut? How do we know? You're telling me you made a statement. You made a statement. Charisha de Rishut, plowing, that's voluntary. Charisha means plowing. The Rishut means it's voluntary. How do we know that it's talking about Charisha Rishut? It's Dilma Charisha Omed the Mitzvah. Maybe you were plowing. Maybe when the Torah says you're plowing Charisha HaOmer, the Charisha of Omer, of the korban Omer, which is a mitzvah. Maybe we said there's no such thing as plowing a mitzvah. What do you mean there's no such thing as plowing a mitzvah? The Torah tells me I have a mitzvah to go ahead and cut the the omer, the barley, and bring it as a korban. So I have a mitzvah to cut it. That means I have to have it. I need to have it. How do I have it? In order to have it, what do I need to do? I need to plow. I have to have a land. I have to have a crop. Part of the process of the crop is of having this crop is plowing. So we found that there is such a concept called charisha of mitzvah. If I could show, right, exactly, right. That's what the Gemara exactly. That's why this text says that that discussion was not on the wood, was on this area. That's what the Gemara says. That's the second version of the Gemara. So the Gemara's challenge is he wants to understand Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel made a statement. What was Rabbi Shmuel's statement? The pasuk says, Dr. Navid, on Shabbat, you have to refrain from plowing and harvesting. And plowing, we know, is a voluntary act. It's not a mitzvah to plow. So too, when the Torah says you can't harvest, only when it's a voluntary act. But if it's a mitzvah act of harvesting, you would be able to harvest on Shabbat. Is that clear? That's what he said. So comes one of the rabbis and he questions the premise. He questions the statement that you said plowing is voluntary. Who says? Now, because I have a case that plowing is not voluntary. Now, once I establish that plowing is not voluntary, that there's such a situation, and yet the Torah says on Shabbat, I want you to refrain from plowing on Shabbat. And if plowing is both voluntary, sometimes mitzvah. So therefore, when the Torah says about harvesting right next door to that word, and it says harvesting, also you should refrain, it should also be referring to a similar situation, whether it's mitzvah, whether it's voluntary or not voluntary. And therefore, you should not be able to harvest on Shabbat, even for the purpose of a what? Of a mitzvah. If the pasuk, when it talks about plowing, it's referring to even a plowing of a mitzvah you have to refrain from, so the harvesting would also be a harvesting of mitzvah. If plowing is only referring to a voluntary act, so the harvesting is only a voluntary act. Because there's something called a hekesh. The Torah compares two items next to each other, that connecting each other to teach us that they have similarities. So we're connecting this. We're connecting the harvesting to the plowing. Whatever the case of the plowing is, that's the case of the harvesting. If the plowing is talking about voluntary type of act, the harvesting is a voluntary type of act. If the plowing is even referring to an act that's mitzvah, so then the harvesting is even talking about an act that's mitzvah. So that's the Gemara's question. You know, you want to say something? Bechorish u'makotze tishpo. I want you to refrain on Shabbat from plowing and harvesting. That's the pasuk. Pasuk connects them together. All right? So what is plowing? Is plowing a mitzvah or plowing of something that you don't do voluntarily? What is plowing? Think about plowing. So now the Gemara is saying evidently it could be either. Plowing could be, and if it could be either, then the harvesting would be either. And Torah says tishbot, you have to refrain from it. Morris, good, clear? So the Gemara shoots back, Amalei. So what does Rava say? So Rava says, Kivan the imatza charush, ina choresh. If what happens, you find the field plowed. Now the Torah gives you a mitzvah to bring the korban omer. It means you got to have barley. You have to have barley. You have to have the new crop of barley for the second day of Pesach. But what happens now? What happens if you've come to a field and you want, and now you want to do it for the mitzvah, but you already found it plowed? The field that you had was the guy plowed a field. You bought a field from a guy, and the guy plowed the field. Do you have a mitzvah to plow the field? No, it's already plowed. The idea of plowing a field, even though I need for the korban omer, but that's not something that's integral part of the mitzvah. Good morning. Good morning, Jake. The mitzvah could be accomplished without me doing it, without this being done by me. Therefore, that's not labeled mitzvah. It's maybe called a preparation for a mitzvah, and therefore we do not find that the Torah is talking about a case of something that's defined as a real mitzvah in itself. So therefore, it's back to the old story that it's not a real mitzvah case, that the Torah is telling you that I want you to refrain from doing an act of mitzvah on Shabbat. The Torah, because of mitzvah omer, because when the Torah says I want you to refrain from plowing, the plowing itself is not defined as a mitzvah itself. It could be maybe a preparation to help you with a mitzvah, but since it's not defined as a mitzvah itself, so only something that's not a, what did I say? Again, however, therefore, we're going to get to that. So therefore, since plowing is not a mitzvah in itself, so the harvesting that the Torah said that you can't harvest is also when the harvesting is also not a mitzvah in itself. Similar to the plowing, because we never found that the plowing is a mitzvah in itself. So the harvesting is exactly the same type of case. And when the Torah says you can't harvest, it's also if it's similar to the plowing. But if you have a case of harvesting which is not similar to the plowing, where there's a special mitzvah to cut the barley, there's a special mitzvah to cut the barley. You see that will be different. Then you could do that on Shabbat.
Because it says plow and harvesting together, you say that plowing is always a preparation, it's never a mitzvah.
Because we never found.
That must be also the harvesting, also talking about a case where it's only
Right, volunteer, right.
Volunteer and preparation. I mean, it's not a mitzvah.
Right, but if you would find the harvesting a mitzvah in itself,
It would be a preparation for
but then it's a mitzvah in itself. Then a mitzvah in itself, you can't violate the Shabbat. You can violate the Shabbat. Omer is a mitzvah. There is a mitzvah in itself. Correct. So the Gemara says. So there is a mitzvah in itself for harvesting for the Omer, but there's no mitzvah in itself for plowing. So therefore, if you find for plowing, then the Torah says, I want you to refrain from plowing. So therefore, it would similarly mean when Torah says refrain from harvesting, it would be similar to the type of case of plowing. If plowing applies both by mitzvah and non-mitzvah, so then, and the Torah says, I want you to cease from that, not to plow. If plowing could apply by mitzvah, so then the harvesting would also apply by mitzvah. The prohibition, the meaning when Torah says, I want you to stop, don't plow, wanting to derail. Torah says, I want you to stop, I don't want you to plow. If plowing is referring to both mitzvah and non-mitzvah, so the harvesting would also, the Torah says, I want you to stop, is also referring to mitzvah and not mitzvah harvesting. But if plowing is only talking about non-mitzvah, there's no such thing as plowing that's a mitzvah. So when the Torah says, I want you to stop from plowing and harvesting, it's putting together, it's connecting the harvesting to the plowing to say that the situation that I'm obligating you to refrain from harvesting if it's only similar to the plowing.
So which one follows which?
The harvesting follows the plowing, meaning to say that if it's a harvesting that's
Even if you don't find the plow, you still follow the plow.
the harvesting, the fact that the Torah puts harvesting next to plowing means that they have the same law. And now, so now,
There's no case that is mitzvah.
Right.
So which follows which? The plow, you're saying the
Harvesting
follows the plow.
which means what? To set that the only time, it's only a voluntary.
It's not.
In fact, that only in a case that's voluntary. But it doesn't get knocked out. The Torah is not telling you, in a case when it's a mitzvah, the Torah is not telling you can't harvest when it's a mitzvah. The Torah is only telling you can't harvest when it's similar to plowing when it's voluntary. That's right. There's no shed there, right? No, but we come on to this connection between Charish and Katsir. There's a special mitzvah to cut the barley for the aroma. That's the mitzvah. The cutting itself is a mitzvah. Meaning to say, the Gemara is going to say eventually, even if you found you had cut barley, somehow, let's say a guy cut the barley, You have a still mitzvah to cut. You have to, there's a mitzvah for you to found that bar, there's a mitzvah for you to cut the bar. And therefore, it would also be, you'll be allowed to even do it on Shabbat. Because the total, why?
Order is coming from this Shabbat, 3 weeks. And you have a mitzvah already, that you have to cut off. Why can't you
Because
do
the
that?
Torah
Only
get,
the
okay, you know that a Brit Milah is coming, 6 is coming, but you still have a right.
That's
You know the Shabbat is coming because the Torah right, the Torah wants you to cut it on that particular day. The Torah is giving you a mitzvah to cut the barley on that day. There's a mitzvah to cut the barley, like similar to on Brit Milah. That the Torah gives a date. So you're supposed to go ahead, but you're supposed to cut it also. There's a mitzvah to cut it. 60th day. Yes. I think they would cut it the night before and they would bring it in the morning. All right. There's a Rashi somewhere. Yeah. You need a Ksira Lishma. Right. Right. That day. Yes.
Well, Rabbi, I want to put it-
Yes.
We voted on this case, we were comparing it to the wood case. But at the end of the day, when we asked the wood case.
I don't know if we compare it to the wood case. We brought in this that some had that, the type of discussion we had by the wood, that discussion wasn't found by the wood. They discussed it in this area. I mean, the Gemara, they had this type of debate back and forth regarding this mitzvah, regarding the mitzvah of similar, it's right, similar, but it's not right. Right, but here we come from, right, this is not going with, this has its own markings, own stuff. So now,
What is the point of where we go from?
no, because we're trying to, again, we're trying to understand. Right, again, we're trying to, now we're in Rabbi Shmuel's opinion, we're trying to understand, we had the Gemara before, very good. As Michael pointed out, and Dave, Dr. Navid, the Gemara earlier was talking about things that have to do with Makkos. Makkos have to do with involuntary murder, non-intentionally to murder someone. And the Gemara before said that the case that the Torah says that you go to exile is that when you were involved in an act that was a voluntary act. But if you were involved in a mitzvah, if let's say you were the messenger of the court, and let's say you were hitting the person, while you were involved in hitting the person, giving lashes to the person dies. You were involved in a mitzvah, you were a father training your son, and the son died as a result of the discipline of the father. So the Gemara said beforehand, you do not go to exile. That's the subject matter of this parak of Makkos. We're discussing exile. And on that, the Gemara had questions. How do you know that law? Because you tell me that the pasuk, when the Torah talks about going to exile, the pasuk is talking about you were involved in chopping wood, you were involved in a voluntary type of act. That's how, and therefore, but if you be involved in a mitzvah, then you will not go to exile. That's what the Gemara said yesterday. Today, the Gemara says that some have a discussion, and then we had a subsequent discussion in the Gemara questioning that point. How do you know? How do you know that? How do you know the case of the forest is that you're involved in a voluntary act? Maybe the case of the forest, you're involved in cutting wood for the sukkah. How do you know? Maybe even a mitzvah. How do you know that maybe even if you're involved in a mitzvah, someone gets killed unintentionally, maybe you would have to go to exile. That was the discussion yesterday. Today, the Gemara has a similar discussion regarding a different situation. So that's the connection of the Gemara. That the same way the Gemara question, how do you know that pasuk is referring to non-mitzvah, voluntary, maybe it's referring to mitzvah. So the Gemara has some have that discussion by this law of cutting the omer. Same type of question.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be cut and it wouldn't be in one.
But it doesn't make a difference. The question, but it's the concept, but it's the question. I understand, but it's true. Right. But now we're talking about, but then we had a discussion. The Gemara had a discussion trying to understand that law, the law that has to do with exile. which you told me that if your guy was involved in a mitzvah and someone gets killed as a result of the mitzvah that the person's involved with, you told me that he does not go to exile. That's what you told me. And you told me you have a source, and you try to tell me what your reasoning for that is. What did you say? Again.
There's a connection there, but like, you got something.
But again, but no, Jake, I with all due respect,